in 2012. As spirit-filled people of God, we must be aware of the cultural and contextual realities while while recognizing spirituality as our unique foundation of leadership. What I mean is a generation that is very, very spiritual and love to talk spiritual language. And this is, I've done this research at a global level. So this is in Nigeria. This, first of all, Africa is the, I'd say, the seedbed of spirituality if we're thinking globally. So in some ways, the rest of the world is catching up with the spirituality that Africa has always had. Um, as one leader said in Africa, in Ghana, he said, even the most secular African is also spiritual. So I thought, oh, the rest of the world is catching up with that. So when we see this in the West, where young people said, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious, they're starting to realize spirituality is fluid and it is part of all of life, and it's not sort of compartmentalized in sort of a religious framework. It's part of all of life. But as I am a spirit-filled leader, and we have been talking about the power of the Holy Spirit for years, this is a great time for us to connect with this generation, because the Holy Spirit is the chief spirituality connection with this generation. In other words, we want people to get to know the person and the power of the Holy Spirit, the person, power, and work of the Holy Spirit, more than we want them to get to know the church that's called the Spirit-filled Church. So spirituality, in essence, refers to a higher power that infuses meaning. The Holy Spirit is foundational in spiritual leadership that provides meaning and direction to a generation in search of meaning, belonging, and identity. Now, I think this changes depending on what part of the world we're discussing meaning, belonging, and identity. I in part speak about identity as an African American, because having I'm a son of slaves on both sides, my mother and father's sides, and so our identity as African Americans was forged in the fire furnace of slavery, American slavery, where people were ripped from the continent of Africa in different countries and tribes and brought here as one identity, being Black, with complete disrespect to the many different cultural diversity that is in the continent of Africa, particularly West Africa, where most of our ancestors came from. But even West Africa is too much of a general statement, as you know. There are many countries and many colonized countries, but within the colonized countries, there are many tribes which are also nations, with different cultures and different languages and different, and all of that was brought here and forged into one identity as African Americans. So that leaves us with ambiguity about who we really are, from a heritage perspective. And so the search for identity is something that is a huge thing within the context of African American and people in the African diaspora broadly, really. For many of them don't know how to track their heritage back to what tribe. But so that's a big one here. But belonging is another one. Do I belong? And that's not just country or nation belonging, national belonging. It has to do with, do I belong in this group? In this, are these friends? Do my friends accept me? In this school, in this church, when people say I'm spiritual but I'm not religious, I don't want to go to church because they don't feel like they belong in the church. On this job, do I belong? This question of belonging is huge. And then meaning. What meaning is also broad. I'm going backwards here. Identity, belonging, meaning. Meaning has to do, as I mentioned it here, has to do with, what does it mean to be me? And that has to do with, what is my calling? What are my gifts? What contribution do I make? Am I loved because of, do I contribute something that is meaningful to our community? At this job, what does it mean for me to be here? So this, another way to put it is the search for significance. And there are four crucial concerns that impact Gen Z in its relationship to faith. The first is spiritual, the second one is technological, the third one is social psychological, the fourth one is personal and communal, and this includes family as well. Revisioning faith in this generation necessitates one, normalizing advanced technology as part of congregational life. Two, developing communities of meaning. So these are not just communities of worship, they're communities of meaning. So I get significance by being a part of this community. Three, committing to diligent prayer. And four is involving young people in rethinking the way we do church. And five is connecting faith to relevant needs in everyday life. Now, here are the issues. Number one, political ideology. Number two, we need bold confession. There is bold confession of disaffiliation. This is not as prominent in places like Ghana, but in Nigeria, it is a mixed bag. Some people sort of boldly say, "I don't go to church." Others are not that bold. So you got sort of both ends of the spectrum in Nigeria. Growing multiple secularisms. Now, it used to be Western secularism. Everybody thinking about, um, um, Amsterdam or Holland, and sort of the Western secularism that is prominent there, and seeing that sort of Western secularism making its way around the Western world, including America, and sort of infiltrating parts of Africa, like South Africa, for example. But we're seeing that there is not one secularism. Research is showing that there are multiple secularisms. They're not all having the same ideology that's at play, sort of this Western education that is about humanism. Some of the secularisms are homegrown, and they are questions that are being raised from the fabric of the local context that question Western world, for example. Things like in America, is Christianity the white man's religion? So it's an affront to Western ideology, but it's secularism nonetheless, because it's raising a question to threaten the fabric of the Christian faith by virtue of suggesting that Christianity is part of Western imperialism and not a viable faith for people of color. And then we're seeing it also in certain breakoffs from other religions, like breakoffs from the Muslim religion. There are people who claim to be Muslim, but they're not really faithful to Islam. They draw upon that framework, but don't really go to mosque. Are not faithful. They use that as an affront to sort of a Western politic. And they're not doing a lot of things they're doing because they're religious. They're doing it because they are just against something else. We see that here in the United States with, say, the Nation of Islam. There are some who are faithful to that tradition and really follow it religiously. There are others who convert to it but don't really subscribe. It is an affront to Western Christianity, if you know what I mean. So many secularisms, right? And then the demographic issue, such as increased formal education. Education is a two-edged sword, right? It's great on the one hand, but it's a challenge on the other hand, because formal education increasingly is dismissing the foundation of religious moral framework. Is claiming its moral framework from other places, like family tradition, or being a good person, and just sort of pulling from different religions. There was a time when moral framework was sponsored by organized religion, and in the West, Christianity. Now it's you love for love's sake. You know, what is justice? When Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about justice in the United States, he was drawing upon a definition or framework of justice that was deeply rooted in scriptural principles. But now, when we think about people marching with some of the black marches, people are marching and saying, I want justice, but they're not appealing to a Christian framework of justice. They are talking about something else. Maybe vindication, maybe revenge, maybe something. We're not quite sure where they're getting that moral framework for justice. So there is an evaporation of Christian foundation for the meaning or the ideological superstructure for terms that we use. Like, what is love? Love used to be grounded here in the States in sort of a Jesus framework, but love means something else now, right? Um, it's not necessarily trying to follow Jesus. And I would even say that in many cases, I don't know that Christians are really following Jesus with our claim on love. Um, I'll move on here. On challenging questions about Christianity's participation in racial histories. And what I mean by racial histories, I don't just mean racism in the United States, I mean colonization around the world, or ways in which Christianity has participated in some of the atrocities in the world, like certain Christian traditions that participated in the Holocaust, or certain Christian traditions that participated in slavery, and other expressions of racial history. And then racialized nationalisms, ways in which the nationalism has become not just uh, a claim on certain ideas for the nation itself, but deeply rooted in the in racism, in racial history. Let's see here. I gotta keep moving here. There are several crucial, there are critical factors impacting Gen Z's faith participation. There are several crucial interwoven factors that are impacting the global Christian situation. One is elements of secularisms mixed with non-religious spirituality. So when we talk about secularisms, as I mentioned earlier, it's not a secularism that sort of escapes from any religious talk or God talk, because these secularisms are not like the secularism that say we don't need God, we don't need spirituality, right?